There's a tool in the Cairo Museum that looks almost gentle, a thin bronze rod, slightly hooked at the end. It could pass for a knitting tool or something out of a sewing kit. For over 1,000 years, it was used for exactly one job: reaching up through a dead person's nose, into their skull, and pulling their brain out in pieces. And once it was out, it was thrown away. Not preserved, not honored, discarded like waste. Meanwhile, the heart, the same size, the same amount of tissue, was wrapped like treasure and placed back inside the body with more care than almost anything else in the entire mummification process. This is the story of why. And it's not a story about ignorance. It's a story about a civilization that built an entire, internally consistent theory of the human body and got exactly one thing catastrophically wrong. To understand why the brain got tossed out, you have to understand what mummification was actually trying to accomplish. It wasn't about looking nice for a funeral, it was engineering. Ancient Egyptians believed a person had multiple parts to their identity that survived death. The Ka, a kind of life force double, and the Bay, closer to what we'd call a personality or soul, often shown as a bird with a human head. For the Ka and the Ba to keep functioning in the afterlife, they needed a body to return to, a recognizable, intact anchor point. If the body decayed, the argument went, the soul had nowhere to come home to, and eternal life failed before it even started. So mummification wasn't ritual for ritual's sake. It was, in their framework, the single most practical thing you could do for someone you loved. You were building their eternal life support system out of linen and resin, and every organ removal decision that follows makes sense once you understand that goal. Preserve what matters for eternity. Remove what will only cause the body to rot from the inside. The full process took around 70 days, and the brain removal happened early, often on the very first day. Embalmers, a specific respected profession, not random laborers, would take a bronze hook and insert it through one nostril. The target was the ethmoid bone, a thin, almost paper-like plate of bone at the top of the nasal cavity that separates the nose from the brain cavity. It's actually one of the thinnest bones in the human skull, which made this approach possible in the first place. Once through, the embalmer would rotate and work the hook to break the brain tissue into smaller pieces, essentially liquefying it inside the skull. From there, gravity did a lot of the work. The body would be positioned so the liquefied tissue could drain out through the nostril on its own. For anything that didn't drain, embalmers sometimes used a whisk-like tool to further break it down, or introduced substances that helped dissolve the remaining tissue. This is confirmed by more than just ancient texts. Modern CT scans of mummies, done without unwrapping them using imaging technology, consistently show the same signature: a fractured or enlarged path through the ethmoid bone, and an empty cranial cavity. In some mummies, researchers have found the skull was packed afterward with linen, resin, or in rarer cases, nothing at all, just left hollow. The consistency of this technique across centuries, across different embalming workshops, tells you something important. This wasn't experimental. It was standardized practice, taught and repeated, essentially ancient surgical protocol. Now here's the actual core of the mystery. Why treat these two organs so differently? The heart, called Ib in ancient Egyptian, was believed to be the seat of intelligence, emotion, memory, and moral character. Everything that made you you was thought to live there. This wasn't a minor belief, it was central to their entire vision of the afterlife. In the Hall of Judgment, the heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. If your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it outweighed the feather, and according to the belief, it would be devoured by a creature called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo. That was, essentially, the concept of a second death, the end of your existence entirely. If your heart balanced with the feather, you passed into eternal life. So the heart wasn't just an organ, it was your entire moral record, your memory and your personality, all in one place, and it needed to be present and intact for that final judgment to even happen. The brain in this system simply had no assigned job. It wasn't seen as useless in a scientific sense, it was seen as irrelevant in a spiritual and functional sense. It didn't think. It didn't remember. It didn't need to survive the journey. So functionally, discarding it wasn't a mistake in their eyes. It was closer to trimming something you didn't need before a long trip. The brain's fate becomes even clearer once you see what happened to everything else. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were removed and preserved separately, each placed in its own container, what's now called a canopic jar, and each protected by one of 4 minor deities known as the Sons of Horus. These organs were considered necessary for the body to function symbolically in the next life. Digestion, breath, and so on were still seen as relevant processes worth preserving. The brain didn't get a jar, it didn't get a deity. It got discarded, sometimes literally swept out with the rest of the embalming waste. When you line it up that way, heart preserved, and central to judgment, 4 organs preserved in sacred jars, and the brain treated as leftover material. The hierarchy of what ancient Egyptians believed mattered becomes almost impossible to miss. It's tempting to treat this as an early civilization mistake that got corrected once. It didn't, for a very long time. Aristotle, writing more than 1,000 years after this practice was already standard in Egypt, argued that the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, and that the brain's actual function was to cool the blood, acting essentially as the body's radiator. This was not a fringe opinion. Aristotle was among the most influential thinkers in the ancient world, and this view carried weight for centuries. It took physicians like Galen, working significantly later, to start building serious anatomical evidence for the brain's true role. And even then, cardiocentric theories about the heart as the seat of thought lingered in various forms for a very long time afterward. So when people look at ancient Egyptian embalmers and assume they simply didn't know better, the more accurate framing is this. They were roughly in step with the dominant scientific thinking of the ancient world for well over 1,000 years. They weren't behind. Most of the ancient world agreed with them. Here's the part that makes this story almost tragic, in a historical sense. Egyptian physicians had already written down evidence that contradicted this belief, centuries before the standard embalming practice was even fully developed. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, dated to roughly 1600 BCE but likely copied from a much older source, describes real clinical case studies of patients with head trauma. In several of these cases, the text notes that an injury to one side of the skull caused paralysis or loss of sensation on the opposite side of the body. A real, observable neurological pattern. The papyrus even uses an early form of the word for brain, one of the very first recorded uses of that concept in any known written language. This means Egyptian medicine had already documented in writing that the brain was directly connected to movement and sensation throughout the body. The clinical observation existed, but that observation stayed inside the world of practical medicine. It never crossed over into the religious and funerary framework that governed the afterlife. The doctors saw one thing. The priests and embalmers operated from an entirely separate set of beliefs, and in ancient Egypt, when medicine and religion disagreed, religion controlled what happened to your body after death. Today, researchers can look inside these mummies without ever unwrapping them using CT imaging technology. Study after study confirms the same pattern across dynasties and regions: a damaged or widened ethmoid bone, an empty cranial cavity, and in many cases, resin or linen packed inside where the brain used to be. In a small number of mummies, researchers have found the brain was actually left in place, evidence that practices weren't perfectly uniform across all workshops and time periods, and that individual embalmers or individual family requests sometimes varied, but the overwhelming pattern, confirmed repeatedly, is clear. For well over 1,000 years, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world removed the brain, threw it away, and considered it correct procedure. It's easy to watch this and think, how did they not know? But every civilization operates on its best available theory of how the world works. The Egyptians weren't guessing carelessly. They built a precise, repeatable, professional medical procedure around their best understanding of the human body, and followed it with extraordinary consistency for over 1,000 years. They just built it around the wrong organ. And it's worth sitting with this for a second. Right now, in 2026, there are things we are just as confident about that some future civilization looking back at us might find just as strange. If you want more stories about what ancient people got surprisingly right and surprisingly wrong, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from,